In this episode, we want to talk about something a lot more transformational, right? Like we want to have a transformational dialogue with you. Like what does it mean to be coaching at the level of being? Because I mean, that essentially is very MCC way of coaching, but then no harm for you to learn that right now, because then that's where if that's what you aim towards, then you definitely will fall above the PCC level, right? So for this conversation, the primary competencies we are touching on would be your presence as a coach and also how that evokes awareness within yourself and the client. So we're talking about competency 5, maintaining presence, and also competency 7, evoking awareness, right? So the question that often comes when we talk about coaching at the level of being is this. It's about how do we move the conversation from doing to being, from thought to awareness, from stories to truth, and where do the real shifts and breakthroughs ever actually occur? Like when is it really just a shift? When is it truly a breakthrough? Like have you wondered? Because when it comes to coaching any client, to be honest, even if somebody is not a trained coach, just by being there supporting the client can progress forward because there's already that feeling of support. Or even having that space to talk through what's in their space. But when it comes to something deeper, when we talk about something deeper, it is really down to what kind of shifts are we observing about them? Are they able to, break their habit? Are they able to embody new behaviors? Are they able to, integrate a different being out of the session with you? So perhaps they saw themselves as this sort of person from 20 years ago when they first came into the session. So then there's that gap between who they're being versus actually perhaps what they've achieved. And as a result of your session with them, you see them showing up in a different level of being where they actually are that confident person. They've integrated what they've achieved within themselves and they're up to date. We've updated their system such that that is the point that they are starting off, not from 20 years ago. So that it stops becoming a compensation, but it starts becoming an empowerment. Right? So then the question you want to start with here is, most coaches, when they start off their journey, is always about coming up with action plans, taking action, and the assumption is the person will change. But the truth is a person can take action, but they don't change. They're just very good at taking action. So then the question you want to ask is, at which point does action stop creating real change? And what really is real change, right? The part around creating results or change is never just about the results you create. It's about how the person changes as an individual, right? Because you can use parts of yourself you're already familiar with to implement all these actions. But then it's different if these actions that you need to implement requires you to develop different aspects of yourself. It requires you to show up differently. And perhaps initially there are challenges in showing up because it's very awkward. For instance, trying to do public speaking. But as a person finds an aspect or an essence within themselves that helps them see that, hey, actually, there's this part of me I never knew I had, and then they bring it into their life, then imagine how they will show up differently. What's the state that they embody? And maybe even what is the gravitas that they hold out of what they have shifted in. That is where you know the real change can happen, because when that being shifts or that being, there's a breakthrough in that being, then how the being goes about taking action changes. So real change doesn't just come from being able to achieve the results, but it's also who the person fundamentally is as a result of the change or because of who they are that they create that change. So that's food for thought. And, if let's say you are coaching a client at a certain level, like granted, they can't tell what's deeper and they pay you at this level anyway. They're happy to pay you because they feel that they are growing at every session, or because they're having new knowledge, they feel that they're growing. But then there's also a risk that you're taking, because after a while, at the end of the day, they'll realize that, hey, maybe I'm just going through the sessions having that feel good, but then I'm not really shifting or changing. Maybe I'm getting stuck in an echo chamber with my coach because we are going in circles. So when that does happen, you risk losing your client at some point. Right? So, when we talk about, then we also talk about, how to move the conversation from thought to awareness. Thought is a lot around just what you think, but awareness requires a lot more of you, right? Thinking is your awareness about your own thoughts. But then, your awareness doesn't just come from the mind. Your awareness comes from different parts of you, right? You're not just your mind, you're also your emotions, you're your body. You also have a dream body, your intuitive side, your energetic self, and even your auric self, the part of you that creates an impression based on how you manage life. So with all these bodies that you have, like, what really is awareness? Awareness is your attunement to each of these bodies, to know that they exist, to know how you are sensing into life and experiencing life based on all these different bodies, right? And only when you are immersed in that, then your awareness becomes more acute, it deepens. So that your awareness is not just limited to your mind, but then you are sensing them at every moment. So most people are actually disconnected to these other parts of themselves. Most people just live in their cognitive mind. And because of that, when things happen, when things hit them, they don't know what happened. So then that also goes back to this idea of very limited self-awareness. So the awareness part sometimes is not just in your mind, you just keep drilling deeper and you get more awareness, but rather it is can you expand yourself to connect to the other aspects of yourself in real time in order to feel that. Right. So what's the difference between thinking about a problem and being aware of that? The difference is that you are mentally analyzing what's happening. So to me, it's a matter of I'm thinking about it, I'm knowing, but I'm not realizing. So for instance, I could be thinking like, okay, I'm incomplete about something. Or somebody tells me that, there's something around my past friendships or relationships that I have not gotten over. And that's why certain things that shouldn't be manifesting in my life suddenly appear as a way to remind me of this lesson that I haven't completed. But then the problem is that for most people, when they hear such observation or feedback, even coming from the coach, they might go, I know, but they don't connect to it. So then there's no resonance. And oftentimes it takes a while for that to click because the person is just so much in their mind. And so then the awareness doesn't occur. Only when we come to a state of not just knowing, but then realizing, then it hits you at all your different bodies to know that, hey, this is happening. And what's the response you will see when that happens? It means you start becoming more emotional because you are feeling the pain of your incompletion. Perhaps your body is feeling some sort of tension. So when you start to connect to all these aspects, then they show up to tell you that, hey, actually, you're really incomplete. Your mind may tend to dismiss and make everything okay because the other aspects of you are not feeling it. But when you feel it at the core of your being, that's where it spreads towards the different bodies you have. And that's where you know that, hey, something is happening. It's hitting me. And I now have this awareness and realization, I need to do something about it. Sometimes your clients need to get to that place in order to act on something or whatever issue they have with more of that seriousness. Right? So that is ideally where you bring them to get them to sense and lean into all these aspects of themselves so that they become more whole as a person. Like remember in coaching, especially when it comes to PCC and above, we always talk about coaching the whole person. What's their perspective of things? How are they feeling it? What are the cues we are seeing? Like, why do we do all that? It's to help them connect to all aspects of themselves so that with that connection, they then can use that to realize and therefore find their willingness to work on it and navigate life differently. So the thing about the mind oftentimes is the mind is a very dangerous thing. The mind does not sometimes tell the truth because the mind will naturally, when something happens, the mind will naturally tell itself stories in order to make sense and to be able to live with and to move on with what happened. So that means that a lot of times what we remember of something that happened and how we concluded of it might be very different from what actually happens. But the thing here is, the magical thing here is that actually your body remembers. Your body, you probably heard of the book, Your Body Keeps Score. So your body remembers a lot of things that are incomplete or that has a certain trauma, they get kind of recorded in the body. And so when your mind thinks that something, my childhood actually was quite good. But if you realize that there's some uneasiness or tension in the body, then perhaps it is not what you think. So the thing here is, how do you verify if your experience was real? You have to tune into other aspects of you in order to be able to understand that. So we're talking a lot around self-awareness from the different facets of you as a person. So the thing in short I'm trying to tell you is, don't just buy into the client stories and narratives. That is their world that they're bringing you into. All you need to do is to observe and understand what's their perspective and how they see the world, and in what aspects is it flawed or incongruent that you can, at some level, bring up as observations so that it can bring the client back to reality, break that bubble that they're in, and allow them to see the truth for what it is so that they can move on in the best way forward. In the best way forward possible. So, in short, this is about you coaching the being and not the narrative. What changes when you coach who the client is being, not what they're saying? So, in short, that's what we're talking about. Like, how do you listen for their identity? Sometimes the way they respond, the cues they give you, they may tell you they want something, but then perhaps they're crossing their arms, or they're distracted, or their mind goes elsewhere. So that's where you know there's some degree of incongruence. And it's important to help them to make sense of it, asking questions around it such that you can understand what's causing the dissonance. So the important part of coaching, especially at the mastery level, is this: the ability to give space and silence to the client so that it almost feels like they're facing a mirror, they're just with themselves. There's nobody else there but them. And you are just there reflecting back to them without having to say much. So actually at the mastery level, you talk a lot less than you would at the ACC or the PCC level. It can go to the extent of just giving them space to talk through, and as it comes out, they begin to make sense of it without you having to ask much. So that is where silence is the work. They just need that space, which most people don't give to themselves in a day-to-day basis. We're always just very busy chasing one thing after another, and perhaps end the day in a very exhausted manner. So being able to recognize that that's the life we go through, it means that whatever the coaching session is really is a conduit for the client to sit with themselves and go inwards and find some answers and clarity and resonance within themselves that we can help them make sense with and bring them forward. So actually silence is a very powerful tool when it comes to them being with themselves and finding answers from within. Right? Because you want to ask yourself what emerges when you stop guiding. But instead, what we're talking about is sitting with. The art of sitting with a client often means being able to sit with them in silence, because there's a lot that is being said in silence, as much as you think that nothing is being said. But the thing is, in that silence, can you hear the weight of the words that are coming out that you can't hear, but that you can feel and sense? And that's where, as you grow as a coach, your acute sensing becomes very important. Your ability to see that something is off before your client tells you it's off, that is where you know that you are growing towards mastery as a coach. Right? And you want to ask yourself, what is the discomfort you have sitting in the silence, not knowing what the client is thinking, not knowing where this is going. When you can connect and resonate with it, then that's where you know, actually, this is very powerful, and all you're dealing with is yourself. Like how you're not able to sit with silence, what causes you to be that, so that as you develop yourself in that area, it actually becomes a gift to the client. Like, the saying of silence is being golden. That is what it means, because there's so much in the unsaid that, when you can experience and sense into it, it actually brings a lot to the client, to the table, and to what they're getting out of the session. So try it. So then one question that people always ask at this transformational level of being is, when do you tell when something is a breakthrough versus a breakdown? A breakdown definitely has the aspect of destabilizing. Destabilizing, there's a downward motion. But when it comes to breakthrough, they almost turn upwards again. There is a lot of shedding of what was, causing them to break down, what was holding them down in the first place. And there is that letting go, that freeing, so that they can break through to the next level. So you can almost say that a breakdown comes before a breakthrough. And if you meet a client breaking down during the session, it's important to support them or guide them through that breakthrough so that they live in a state that is higher from when they came in. Right? And I often tell coaches, if a person comes in at a very down state, you may not necessarily need to expect yourself to bring them to a positive state. Sometimes all they need to is to go from negative to neutral. And that is enough, because then it puts them at a place of stability where they can make sense of that depression that they went through. And when they make sense and like really sit with the neutrality, then that's where they're ready to move to the positive. So then the question here is often this, right? Coaching at the mastery level is very challenging because you have to sit with a lot of not knowing. You have to sit with silence. You have to guide the client without knowing much details. So then what does it take to work at this level? It takes a lot of letting go of control. Control of the need to know, of the need to ask questions that are more for your understanding than for the client's forwarding. And being able to recognize that so that you can support them through this whole thing. So to be honest, there's a lot to let go of. Like, you want to ask yourself, what stops you from being able to be silent? How do you let go of the need to fill the space? How do you let go of the need to be the one value adding all the time? But then consider that value adding can happen even when it's just your presence, even though when it's your presence, but in the silence. Right? So that's one aspect of it. But what else do you then need to let go of? The part around not knowing. When you are very comfortable with not knowing, that's when a lot of possibilities can unfold. But when you always have to know, then you always in your mind calculate out, where is it we can get to? How do we get there? And you're almost like mapping out, you're almost trying to guide the client, or I would say in coaching terms that we don't want you to do is to be leading the client, right? Because the mind tends to want to extrapolate, the mind tends to want a solution, and that's not how we function. So you will find that the higher you go as a coach, the more you let go, the more you have to not know, the more you have to work with uncertainty, and you condense yourself to an essence where it takes very few questions to move a client, to help them transform. But instead, it's your presence and your knowing and your embodying of who they are, or the surfacing of aspects of themselves that they don't know are playing out at many levels. That's what's going to shift them at a deep level. That's going to be what's going to help them to transform. So, when it comes to the integration after the being shifts, how do we do that? Once something shifts at the level of being, what happens next? I mean, often the state that they get to is a great state. But then the question is, now they've experienced this being, how do they sustain it? How do they remember the energy of this being? How do they have an anchor that they can come back to when they think about this being? So it's important for the coach to spend some time after the client comes to that level of being, which will help them to do and achieve, to spend some time getting familiar with that state of being, stepping into the shoes, the mind, the embodiment of that being, to unfold how they will go about living life, how they will go about tackling challenges, how they will tackle the issue at hand. And what does it mean when they come from this level of being to taking those actions? So you're almost bringing them through some sort of visualization where they experience it for themselves, they see them doing it. And best of all, like at the MCC level, you will be having them make that shift or change on the spot, or even take action on the spot, so that this thing becomes real. That it's not just an imagination, it's not just a being feeling, but then there's more than that. So, I mean, definitely when we talk about integration, it's about going beyond conceptual to unfolding it into what's real. What does the application look like? So that's where you actually need to bring your client to. So coming back to mastery level coaching, I mean, most of what we've spoken about is already that mastery level. But then, it's still down to how do you truly save the client? How do you stay humble and like a lot of coaches, when they come into coaching, the drive to make that impact often makes them do a lot more versus the sitting with. So I think in essence, what I'm talking about when it comes to coaching at the level of being is your ability to sit with the client, to sit with the not knowing, to sit with the uncertainty and watch the magic happens. But then it's also how clean your being is such that you can hold that presence and embody this shift or this inward looking that they need to go through. Once you can actually connect to that, you allow or you have that capacity to then bring them in, right? I would say that in my journey moving from PCC to MCC, initially there's a lot of noise within, because you're very used to guiding maybe more in a structured way. You actually guide the person through the entire 45 to 60 minutes, to the extent that you feel like you have to run this process all the time, instead of letting the client also take ownership of it. But when you can begin to see that, hey, the client also have their own thing to bring in, the partnering has to happen where they input into their own process, that's where you begin to like really take a back seat. You begin to understand that sometimes it's not about how much you say, it's about what you're being that allows what needs to come for the client come out for them. So there's definitely a fair amount of inner work that a coach needs to do to clear themselves, to become a clean vessel for the client, so that they get what they need within that session itself. So that's where transformation can happen within the session. It's not impossible. Maybe it's impossible, less possible at the ACC level, a bit more possible at the PCC level, but then, at the MCC level, it's almost like a requirement. So take what you are learning here today to consider, what is the being that you carry when you go into your coaching sessions, and what needs to change in order for you to have that clean and deep and powerful coaching presence of a being when you are working with your client. So take that and consider how you need to develop yourself as a coach in order to move towards that, right? Because your initial thing is around, how do you listen? How do you ask questions? How do you make observations? But once you have all these structures taken care of, then it is now I'm so good with my structures, how do I let it go so that the next level can emerge? And it's a level that is very fluid. So give that a try and tell me how it goes. Okay, that's all.